Hi, this is Dr. Churchill, and welcome to our first lecture of Astronomy 305 and Life in the Universe. I hope that you've had a chance to read all the course materials, maybe watch my very long and very boring video about all the things that go on. I'll do my best not to be entirely boring, but it's really hard to, just lecture into a computer and hope to get the inflection and emotion that one really feels about the topic and the passion. But we'll do our best this semester, and I just want to say that I hope that you will find the rest of the course to really broaden your mind, as I said in the first lecture. So without any additional statements about what's required for the class and things like that, because that's all been done in the past, what I'd like to do is go ahead and share my screen with you and show you exactly what I've got here for the lecture slides. I hope you can see my cursor on it, and that will provide at least a little bit of animation to help tide the boredom, so to speak. Anyway, so what we're going to talk about this semester is a science that's called astrobiology. And with astrobiology, we're going to discuss a little bit today what that is, and talk about sort of the criteria for life, and hopefully give you at least an opening volley sensibility of how we think, or why we think, that life is probably very abundant in the universe. Now, I'm not saying civilizations or space aliens and space travelers, I'm just saying life. So we'll be talking about life in all of its various forms of complexity, at least as we know it. Okay, so in a sense, what is it we're looking for? So let's look at our slide here, section 1.1 here of our learning goals. What is it that we're trying to understand? And is it reasonable for us to vision that there is life beyond our own planet Earth? To which the answer is a resounding yes, if you talk to many scientists, not just my opinion. But then we're going to look at the scientific context of how we go about learning more about that. With any science that is growing, that is in its early phases, and studying life in the universe is definitely in its early phases. I mean, it's been around basically almost as long as you've been alive in terms of a real science. Came about in the late 90s, early 2000s. Though there was the first beginnings of looking for life in the 1960s, really it was considered fringe well until the 90s. Okay, so astrobiology actually is a word, like I said, we're going to study, which includes obviously two parts, astronomy and biology. And so that's the context by which this class will be organized, and the study of life is organized. So we have to ask ourselves, how does learning astronomy and knowing about astronomy, stars, planets, galaxies, the universe, the age of the universe, how the chemical elements of the periodic table are forged with time in the cosmos or in the Big Bang, how does that help us understand where life could be in the universe and how abundant life could be in the universe? Okay, so we'll be talking about that. And how does planetary science help? And the reason we focus on planetary science is, we'll talk about briefly, is that we need a platform for life to exist on, and life needs chemical elements, it needs energy, and it needs a transport fluid for metabolism, which water provides. And it turns out that planets orbiting highly energetic stars is a great stable platform over billions of years, number one. And number two, there's hundreds and hundreds of billions of them. That's like a total underestimate. there's about 10 to the 22 stars in the universe. Okay, try to think about that. It's more than the grains of sand on the beach. So that's a lot of places that planets that could host life could exist. All right. And then how does biology help us understand this? And it's obvious we have to study biology on the planet Earth. We have to understand the genetic sequence, amino acids, how lipids and proteins work. And so at this level, we'll have to talk about that as well. Understand, please, I am an astronomer. I am not a biologist. So when we get to the biology and we get to the planetary geology, you know, I'm stretching my expertise. Let's just put it that way. Okay. So the thing about what we're going to do here, though, is that we have to understand life, not just sort of like as it is today on the Earth, but how it got to be the way it is on Earth. And so we have to understand all the basic building blocks and where they came from. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, and then we're going to talk about, where do we target our studies? Okay, within the solar system, where do we target them? And then within the galaxy, where do we target them? And then within the whole universe, do we target them? So if you're not familiar with what a galaxy is, it's the system of stars that our sun exists in, of which there are about 100 billion stars in our galaxy. I think the fourth module, we'll be talking about that in detail. Is it reasonable to believe in intelligent life and space aliens? Well, we have a video on that. You definitely must watch that video as to whether it's reasonable to believe in space aliens or not, in the sense of intelligent civilizations that could either communicate between the stars or at the very least, or travel between the stars. Okay, sort of your Star Trek world. Okay. Throughout the semester, we also are going to study, as what you might call section 1.4 here, how it is we're going to study this possibility. And by the end of the semester, we'll have been pounding on this 1.4 throughout the whole semester. But these are our overall learning goals, if you will, for the semester. And we're going to just introduce them a little bit in this lecture. Okay, so one of the things I want to point out at this bottom statement here is that before we can really embark on studying life in the universe, it's sort of a part of science. We have to define what we're looking for. And sometimes this is what makes science very dry for people. It's like, oh, I've got a bullet list of criteria that define life. And it just seems so clinical and uncreative, but it is creative. And somebody created that list. Somebody had to observe everything around them and try to organize it in a human mind in a way that made sense. And in the same way that a musician has to organize, they understand the details of notes, they understand the detail of scales and different types of scales, like Mixolydian or Dorian or whatnot. And they know that each one, these different scales can evoke a different human emotion. Well, that's one thing to know all that, but it's another to be a genius composer or a genius musician, or to write these songs, let alone perform them. And you may think it's a stretch to think that a scientist does the same thing as that, but it's a human endeavor, science is, and it is a creative process. And it does require, like, I know something about atoms, I know something about atomic physics, I know something about DNA, but how do you put that all together to then ask nature to do an experiment, which in a sense is like writing a song. It's asking nature a question. How do you ask nature a question in a way that you're not just going to get out something that you believe in or you see once and then to choose to believe in, or 3 times and choose to believe in? This is science. I mean, it's very intellectual and left-brained, but it's also extremely creative. You have to invent these things out of your own mind. Okay. All right. So that brings us back to, we have to have definitions. And one of the things that we will have to define as we go through this class is we'll have to define a definition for life. So of course that means there's limits, because there's limits to what we know, because we only know what's on the earth, and we only know what we know about the history of the earth. So we have tremendous limitations in our knowledge. And yet what we're going to do, and this is the part about science, we have to make sure we're not fooling ourselves. And that's the number one thing that scientists are always trying to prove to themselves, that they're not fooling themselves, that they're deducing things and they're inferring things in a logical, objective manner. I mean, it's a discipline, okay? So that limits us to life as we know it, okay? Just recently, there was a news article I saw where people had discovered some life that stretched our boundaries of that understanding, which had to do with some life that was so low in its energy requirements that before we would not have been able to, we would not have defined that as life. But the energy requirements were so lower than any other life form that we had found that all of a sudden we're thinking, sites like Mars, where the energy budget is much lower, or moons of Jupiter like Europa, which has plenty of liquid water in it, in fact, more liquid water than the Earth has, okay? But the energy budget there is so much lower. But now it's sort of like, is it possible that there could be some very low energy life, not just around Europa in our solar system, but in all of the moons, or most of the moons, around most of the large planets that orbit stars, which there's hundreds of billions in our galaxy alone. Okay, so let's move to the next slide then, where we're going to sort of start to introduce these things. Okay, and let me go through here and do this. It seems to be giving me a little bit of a technical difficulty while I'm sharing my screen. Okay. There we go. Okay, sorry about that technical glitch. Now, what we have to understand, what I want you to understand, is science is not just make-believe kind of stuff, all right? We are going to be trying to understand questions about places that are billions of light years away, hundreds of millions of light years away, even if it's something that's 5 light years away. Now, so you know what I mean, a light year is the distance that light travels in a year. And that is a long distance, okay? So basically, it takes about 8 minutes for light to travel from the surface of the sun out to the orbit of the Earth. It takes light about a day to travel from, say, the Pluto's orbit on this side of the sun to Pluto's orbit on that side of the sun. That's a day. It takes 4 years for light to travel to the nearest star, about 10 years on average between stars. And the galaxy itself, the system of stars, takes light 100,000 years to travel across that galaxy, okay? So it's a vast distance. I mean, light's so fast it travels around the Earth 7 times in 1 second. So it's a very, very fast moving form of energy. And we measure distance and how far it can travel in a year. And it travels about 186,000 miles in 1 second. Okay, and there's 31 million seconds in a year. So you can multiply those two together and get how many miles it is. It's a lot. So how can we trust what we're talking about? How can we trust that we are actually learning something meaningful when we can't go there, when we can't actually get in a lab and manipulate it and those things like that? So how much can we trust science when we talk about things we cannot observe nor experiment with? Okay, well, it comes down to something called inference. We put together pieces of evidence here on the Earth. We put together pieces of evidence we gather from the solar system. And we then use logic to tie those things together. And we use logic based upon a simple principle. the principle that the laws of physics are the same everywhere in the universe. Okay, something we can't prove, but we have no evidence contrary to it. And I can tell you that scientists have pushed on that very, very hard. So within certain limits of understanding, I shouldn't say understanding, within certain quantifiable limits, we understand how good that assumption is. And that's important for you to know. We base things on assumptions. We base things on things we've inferred, but we push on those to the limits of our knowledge. And we have very good limits on, say, how much do the constants of atomic physics change over the entire age of the universe? And our limits on that are so good that it's like, well, some constants we know couldn't have changed with one part of 100 million. And so that tells us that at least the laws of atomic physics are good within 1 part in 100 million. And we can play around with the uncertainty in those constants and figure out how much the universe could have been different in the past to see if it's consequential. And it wouldn't be, okay? And so these are the kinds of things that scientists do. And you have to understand that this is very, very rigorous, okay? So astronomers collect light from distant places. And so astronomers, to understand what's going on in those distant places, they have to know the laws of physics and chemistry very well. And they interpret the light based upon the laws of physics. So if I see a pattern in the light that I know came from some carbon atoms, then I'm able to do a lot of physics calculations to tell me what the composition of that gas is, or what the density of the gas is, or how fast that gas is moving, or how old that gas is. You'd be astonished the level that we can do this type of work just based upon lots of years of studying physics and then collecting light and applying what we measure in the light to the physics to get out what's going on, say, 100,000 light years away from here, okay? So I want you to understand that this is a very rigorous process, that everything that we're talking about all semester long is based upon rigorous science, okay? When it's at the cutting, bleeding edge of human knowledge, I will let you know. I will wave my hands and say, you know, this is what we think. This is the hypothesis we have. We are still testing it, okay? We are still composing our song. We are still being creative about understanding what's going on here. Let's see if I can move on to the next slide. Okay, so astrobiology, the definition, we finally get to that rubber hitting the pavement on this definition. Astro for astronomy, biology for biology, put it together, you got astrobiology. Okay, so astronomy is the study of objects in the universe in the cosmological setting, of which Earth here is one of those. And stars are, gas clouds between stars are, galaxies which contain the gas clouds, and also the stars are, the space between the galaxies and how they fit together in the universe, how they move throughout the universe. These are all parts of astrobiology, or I should say astronomy. Now, what I want you to understand is that we want to also look at what are called ecosystems. And so the astronomy, in this sense, we're going to sort of focus it in this class to the astronomy that studies where we can find ecosystems, where life might be, where good platforms for life, where we would find them, how often they exist, how long do they exist, you know, where do they exist, how long do they exist, and how many of them are there, and how varied are they in their properties. This is what the astronomy part of astrobiology is all about, okay? And then with biology, of course, we want to study organic chemistry. And really, when we get down to it, we think that life itself probably was not just planted on the earth from a scientific point of view, but actually developed and became more complex with time. And so we are going to have a section where we talk about starting from regular organic chemistry and moving it into reproductive organic chemistry. and then how that reproductive organic chemistry became very, very efficient and then became more complex. Excuse me. Now, the thing about this is that the organic elements that go into life are actually highly present throughout the galaxies, okay? And in the gas clouds of galaxies, and also in the comets, the frozen debris left over when galaxies form, okay? And on planets. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? But we also will be studying the geologic record of biological variation on the Earth to understand also questions about intelligence. You know, how many times has it arisen on the planet and then become extinct, et cetera, like that. So we'll be studying that. So in the end, we're going to be put together on something called astrobiology. The study of organic life in the cosmological setting is my sort of, you know, quick and easy definition of that. We're going to combine astronomy and biology. It develops a new branch of science. If you haven't heard of it, there's an institute through NASA called the Astrobiology Institute. It was formed in the late 90s. This is various universities have laboratories that are all tied together into a whole through NASA, and they study the development of organic life in the cosmological setting. And there's also an institute called the SETI Institute. That's S as in Sam, E, T as in Tom, I, SETI for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And they also are sort of a nonprofit organization that searches for life in the universe. Okay, so just to hammer in some of these ideas again, I got about 2 or 3 slides here. So first of all, I want you to understand that there's a lot of gas clouds out in space between the stars, and these gas clouds and stars exist in these large structures called galaxies. And we'll talk later about how galaxies, in a sense, are really the ecosystems in the cosmos. It's the way that you can think of an oasis in the desert, where you have some water and some trees and some bushes and foliage. And then, of course, you have all kinds of critters that live through that energy ecosystem that exists there. That's what galaxies are. They're energy ecosystems. They form planets out of gas, and then planets can then form possibly life, okay? So in these gas clouds in space, there is biochemistry going on. I guess I shouldn't call it bio. There is organic chemistry going on. Let me correct myself. There's organic chemistry going on. And you have amino acids. For example, the amino acids that are in your DNA codons are found freely floating around through the chemistry in these gas clouds. So that's what this image over here on the left is trying to talk about. These gas clouds then will contract, form stars. The stars around them will, the debris that forms with them will form planets. And so this organic chemistry is built into the actual formation of planets and comets and asteroids and things like that, I should say, that are floating around these solar systems. I don't want to say floating, that sounds like there's no gravity, but they're actually gravitationally bound to the central star and orbiting it, in the sense that the space shuttle orbits the Earth, and the moon orbits the Earth, and the Earth orbits the sun. Okay, so in this image to the right here, I'm showing 3 objects from our own solar system. Earth, of course, our beautiful jewel from which all life that we know it exists. And here's the planet Mars. You can see its relative size, and you can see that it has water ice caps on it. We'll be talking a lot about Mars. There's a lot of evidence that Mars was covered with liquid water oceans in the past, had an atmosphere, and it may have developed some early biological life that now has maybe gone underground and lives in caves and things like that. We would like to go to Mars and find the answers to those questions. This is the moon Europa. This is a moon of Jupiter, and it has more water under its surface and just a subsurface ocean that's very thick and deep, that has more water on it than Earth does. I want you to just Think about that for a minute. If you take all the water off of Earth and put it into a big sphere, it actually turns out to be about smaller than the size of Europa, obviously. And that's kind of frightening when you think that all of the water on Earth would be a sphere about this big. And then if you take all the water that's on Europa and turn it into a sphere, it's a bigger sphere. And it actually is a bigger volume of water on the planet Europa. And Europa gets a lot of its energy, it's far away from the sun, about 5 times further. So it gets 1/25 as much sun. And we'll talk about how the sun energy drops off with distance in a later chapter or module. So it turns out that it gets its energy from Jupiter itself. By being in the vicinity of Jupiter and orbiting Jupiter, it experiences extreme tidal forces. And those tidal forces actually cause it to breathe in and out and have tides in the same sense that we have tides on Earth. And that warms the planet or warms the moon. And there's a low energy budget, but maybe high enough to sustain simple life. Now, these planets, for example, the Earth, they live in sort of a Goldilocks zone around stars. So the thing about life, as we'll talk about, is that it needs energy and it needs a stable platform on which to exist. And planets around stars provide this very well. And the Earth, for example, is in this very nice Goldilocks zone. So the bottom picture here is our sun and its solar system showing Mars, Venus, Earth, and Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars's orbits. Like you can see their relative sizes compared to the sun. And here's the Earth in green. This sort of this green patch here is something called a habitable zone. We'll talk about that in detail later, but it's kind of a sweet spot or a Goldilocks zone in which liquid water can exist on the surface of a planet that's sort of around the mass of the Earth. Now, we have studied many, many other stars and found thousands of planets around these stars that we've studied. And here is an example of something called the Kepler-22 system. Kepler is a space satellite, and it has studied these systems. They're all numbered in order that they've been studied or at least been observed. And so then once they've been studied, if a planet's been found around it, the star is called Kepler-22a, and the first planet discovered around it would be called Kepler-22b. Well, Kepler-22b is this kind of a super Earth. It's more massive, a little bit bigger than the Earth, but notice that for the Goldilocks zone, the habitable zone around Kepler-22a, that Kepler-22b orbits in that zone, which is to say there is reason to believe that liquid water could exist on the surface of Kepler-22b. So what are we going to do? We're going to develop an experiment, and we're going to collect light from the Kepler-22 system that is going to tell us whether there's water on that planet or not. And later in the semester, I'll tell you how we're going to do that. Now, beautifully, I think it's on Halloween of 2021 is the projected date for the launch of the new James Webb Space Telescope. And it's going to be a planetary system eating machine. It's going to actually be able to measure the chemical composition in the atmospheres of planets such as Kepler-22b. And that's going to happen in your lifetime. So you're taking a course now, and in that course, we don't know about water on other planets definitively. In 5 years, we will know that. And that is the progress and how rapid it is happening. So I want you to understand also that things that we learn in this course today will be replaced with new knowledge. And we're always doing that. That's the beautiful thing about human knowledge, is that we're always pushing it. Now, as far as the biology and the context of biology in the astronomical setting, in other words, astrobiology, we're going to go all the way down to when the atoms were formed and where the atoms are formed. For example, you're going to learn that the hydrogen in your body was forged in the Big Bang 13.6 years ago. Excuse me, 13.6 billion years ago. Okay, that's when hydrogen atoms were forged in the Big Bang, okay? But the other elements were forged later, about 5 to 6 billion years later, they started being formed. The periodic table was very uninteresting until about 5 or 6 billion years ago, or 5 or 6 billion years into the age of the universe, maybe 7 billion years ago. And stars started to create these other elements in the periodic table. And then, of course, we have to study how they come together as molecules, how they come together then as organs and cells. What is a cell? How is it structured? And then we want to then talk about the specialization of cells and how you end up getting organisms that are more complex, and how we define, where along here do we define what life is? Okay, at some level we go down this chain. When is it that we call it life? We'll talk about that. But then, of course, going further into astrobiology means also going into biogenesis, going from these kinds of things to these kinds of things to these kinds of things, biogenesis. Developing ecosystems and how they work, we have to understand that. And then, of course, how that whole process comes together on a biosphere, it's called the bioma. And then where do you find biospheres? Okay, around other stars. We just talked about Kepler 22b. Could be a beautiful biosphere. Has it become an ecosystem where biogenesis has taken place? Well, it turns out that we have designed experiments for the James Webb Space Telescope that should give us some pretty strong evidence about the answers to those questions. Okay, so what are some central questions to astrobiology? Okay, all right. So some of the questions that are central at astrobiology are, how and where does the universe make and harbor the raw chemicals elements for life? I just told you something about hydrogen was forged in the Big Bang 13.6 billion years ago, whereas carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, the atoms that you breathe that are in your body, were forged in stars, say, 6 billion years ago. Okay, and how abundant are each of them, and why do they have their relative abundances? What are the ingredients of the universe? So we'll have to talk about that. How and where in the universe can or do these raw chemical elements partake in biological processes called life? Can life exist elsewhere? We're going to say yes, so we're going to act like it's yes, and we're going to go out and try to answer that question. We have to be optimistic. Remember what they say, a lack of evidence is not evidence for the lack of something. Okay, there's a lot of needles in a huge haystack. Okay. For Earth, then we have to also ask the question, what's its origin history and what's its future? Okay, for life elsewhere, how related is it to those kinds of our path? Okay, so in astrobiology, people study geology, they study biology, they study physics, they study astronomy. Engineering is involved because to do astronomy, you have to build telescopes, you have to have physics equipment in the lab, you have to have microscopes, you have to be able to make core samples, things like, there's engineering involved in doing all of these sciences. And I should have started with chemistry so that I could have come back and ended on engineering. But, chemistry, organic chemistry, geology, biology, physics, astronomy, and all of these things come together to form astrobiology in a sense, if you want to actually partake in doing the science, even though astrobiology as a name kind of limits itself to the astronomy and the cosmological setting of biology, okay? How do we study the possibility of life beyond Earth? We're going to get into this, and so we have to look for the environments that are conducive to biogenesis, the origin of life and the ongoing existence of life. They have to be stable so that there's billions of years for life to persist on them. Okay, we're going to start with the Earth and the solar system. We're going to move out of the solar system into the galaxy, and then we're going to move into the universe at large. So you can see that our numbers of places that we can find these things are going to increase. We're going to learn how common they are in the solar system, how common they are in the galaxy, how common they are in the universe, and we want to determine how long they persist, as I've talked about many times. Currently, we are now performing experiments to look at these conditions, not just on our planets, but also in our solar system. And as I've told you with Kepler and the new satellites, which we'll talk about throughout the semester that are being built, and some of them flying now, will be looking at stars orbiting other planets. And so that brings me to my magic word. The magic word is believe. And the reason I want to use that word is because when I say I believe in something, I want you to know that it's that I am using lots of scientific information, and to the best of our intellectual capability, I am making inferences based upon that information, to which then I will say, and I'll look you in the eyes and say, I believe that there is life that exists elsewhere in the universe. It's not just a random belief. It is based upon a body of evidence and reasoning and logical inference, okay? You can't prove it. But now, having said that I believe it, I also will tell you, we haven't found it. And if we haven't found it, why should I believe in it? Well, that's the thing. We are explorers by nature, and we will explore until we can find it and find the evidence for it. And if we keep exploring, and the probability that we're right continues to go down, someday people might say, I don't believe there's life out there. But it's not based upon willy-nilly stuff. We don't read what somebody says on the internet and then just decide that we believe that. We don't suffer from something called confirmation bias. And I just want to say that this year 2020 has been very illuminating for understanding human psychology of confirmation bias, because we are so split over this pandemic, okay, as to whether we believe it exists or whether we don't believe it exists, whether we listen to the scientists or whether we listen to the politicians, okay, or conspiracy theorists. Trust me, when it comes down to it, hands down, the scientists know what they're talking about above all else. And I'm not trying to be arrogant about that, but politicians should listen to the scientists. You should listen to the scientists. And the question is then, do you believe that you can trust the scientists? I can't help you there. If you don't want to trust scientists, that's a whole different area, and I can't address it with science. So anyway, that brought me to the magic word, because I wanted to have an opportunity to talk about how it's very important that when you hear people talk about things that come from science, that you understand it's been done in the most rigorous way. And that when people say, I believe, that doesn't mean they can prove. It means that at that point in time, that's to the best of their knowledge what they can infer. And they maybe even can deduce, from which they develop a hypothesis or a belief. Okay, so when you hear people say those things and then they change their mind later, that's part of science. Science is not a dogma which is set in stone. Science is not, I did an experiment, therefore I know the answer and it's never going to change. No, it's to the best of my ability, to the best of the experiment. That's what I've been able to say to date. And as more evidence, more precision comes in, more information, then the inference or the hypothesis or the belief can change. I don't think people should give science a hard time for that. My momentary soapbox. Thank you for listening. All right, our last thing is something that's very important. So I want you to refresh yourself, maybe pause the video, get refreshed, put on your thinking cap again, or take it off and let it relax and put it back on fresh, get a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do. And I need you to listen to these next few slides because they're very critical pieces of information. And given that you have a quiz and an exam on some of this material. Okay. The book makes a big deal out of this. I'm going to make a big deal out of it because it's a very good little chart for organizing our thoughts. Reasoning that organic biology is very common throughout the universe. Okay, I'm not saying life, I'm saying organic Well, I guess I am saying life, organic biology, simple, even simple life forms, okay? All right. Again, this is mostly based on Earth history and everything that we've learned astronomically. Okay, so number one, before we get to our three things, let's just talk about an assumption. The assumption that Earth-like habitable planets, let me just double check what I got in my yellow box here. I got to think about this. Assumption, Earth-like habitable planets are not uncommon. It was the double negative that threw me. Okay, so the assumption is that Earth-like habitable planets are not uncommon. Okay, in other words, Kepler 22b is a habitable planet, and that there are lots of them out there. Okay, they're common, not uncommon means common throughout the universe, and we'll show that this assumption is correct throughout this class. Okay, well, at least in our galaxy, planets of this nature are very common. In fact, we're going to do some estimates later in the around chapter 10 that the numbers will boggle your mind how many planets like this there must be in the universe and in the galaxy. Okay, so let's look at these three lines. So we have evidence that organic molecules form easily and naturally. Okay, we have evidence that life appeared early in the history of Earth, and we have evidence that life can survive under a wide range of conditions. Okay, so going back to that, organic molecules are found in gas clouds. They're found in the cometary debris and the meteorites and the debris of formed solar systems. They are found on planetary bodies. Okay, certainly on Earth, and we're just at the point where we're finding organic molecules on Mars. Okay, so evidence that life appeared early in the history of the Earth. We're going to talk about this in one of our modules, that life seems to have formed very rapidly. In fact, we'll show a video later that it seems that Earth went immediately to something called slime ball Earth, that once it got through the bombardment period, it became this slime ball of mold and bacteria that then took billions of years to form into more complex life. So life itself, the evidence that it existed very, very, very early in the history of the planet is quite strong, and we'll talk about that. And I guess the point is that there's no reason to believe that the Earth is an uncommon habitable planet. And first of all, planets that are habitable are common. That's what the yellow box is saying. But then the Earth itself, as one of those habitable planets, there's no reason to believe that it's uncommon. Okay, we'll talk about that. Okay, third one down here at the bottom, evidence that life can survive under a wide range of conditions. Again, we will talk about life and its definition, and we'll talk about life that lives with very, very, very low energy budgets that can exist in the frozen tundra and literally is dormant for 6 months out of the year with no sunlight, to life that is called the extremophiles in the hot side of things. They don't live off of photosynthesis, they live off of sulfuric acid. Okay, sulfuric acid, okay? And at temperatures that are 700 or 800 degrees Fahrenheit, more than twice the heat of your oven on broil, and in pressures that are 100 times greater than what we experience here on the surface of the planet in an atmosphere. So if you can have life under those wide range of conditions, I mean, every ecosystem that could be filled by the planet, or that life could fill up on our planet, that it's been populated. Life has found a way, and it's very, very diverse biochemistry, if you will, reproductive biochemistry. Okay, so slide 10 of 10, yay, we're finally there. Okay, some walkaways. Okay, walkaways. There's no evidence for life beyond Earth yet. Okay, that we really strongly believe there is going to be evidence for life beyond Earth, and it may happen in our lifetimes. Certainly, ecosystems, if you will, habitable systems will be found, I believe, within the next 5 to 10 years. All right. There are a multitude of good reasons to believe life is widespread in the universe. I hope that I've given you a little bit of a feeling for that. We're really going to pound through that as the semester advances. Okay, excuse me. As far as life goes in our own solar system, we have some good candidates: Mars, Europa, and Enceladus. Okay, gosh, even one of the moons of Neptune might have some subsurface life on it. And there's another moon, Titan, around Saturn, which has lakes on its surface of methane. The only other body in the solar system have a liquid on its surface. Anyhow, the energetics, the chemistry, and the stability and the transport medium of some form of liquid exists in other places in our solar system. So we want to go there and we want to find out, could life be there? But if it is, it's going to be very, very simple microbial life. So that's my third check. And last thing is I want you to understand is that you are part of a tremendous story, a story that, as we know, we only know about going back 13.6 billion years. Before that, we don't even know what before that means. Okay, so that's the edge of human knowledge. But back to 13.6 billion years ago, your story that gives rise to us being here and having this conversation today, is that there was a big bang, atoms formed, hydrogen and helium formed about 300 to 1,000 seconds after the Big Bang, a very narrow region of time. And then there was this period where this plasma existed, and then it cooled, and then the electrons that were free and moving around bound together into neutral atoms that we see today. That happened when the universe is about 380,000 years ago, old. And then there were these dark ages, and then gas coalesced, and then the first stars formed some maybe 8 billion years ago. And then the stars did nuclear reactions in their cores, and the nuclear reactions fused hydrogen and helium into carbon and nitrogen and oxygen. Then those stars exploded or pushed their gas back out into space, from which new stars formed with planets that had chemistry like carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and amino acid molecules and organic goop and all these things, from which then life could form. And so literally those elements, the iron, the nitrogen, the oxygen, all of these elements from the periodic table that are on the planet Earth, okay, they all came from being at one point in the core of a previous generation of star in our region of our galaxy. In our little region of our galaxy, stars that seeded it with chemical elements, and then our planetary system formed. And those elements, the water you drink, the oxygen, the hydrogen in the water, 13.6 billion years old, the oxygen in the water, probably about 5 billion years old, formed in the center of a star. The oxygen you breathe, the nitrogen you breathe, the phosphorus in your body, all of it. Okay, I think you get the point. So we literally are made of star stuff. And that's something also we're going to talk about in a follow-up lecture. Okay, so I hope you have somewhat enjoyed our first audiovisual lecture. I want to say, remember the magic word, go take the attendance quiz. I also want to say that don't forget to watch the video and take some notes on the video. And then I want you to take the lecture quiz. And then, of course, after you've taken the lecture quiz, that you need to hand in the homework. All of those are due by Friday night at 11:59 p.m., at which point then the solutions will be open. As you know, just to remind you, and you can sign off now if you don't want to be reminded of the way the class runs, but the touch base quiz should be finished by Tuesday at midnight. And then on Friday, you have the attendance quiz, you have the lecture quiz, and you have the homeworks due. The answers for the lecture quiz become available after midnight on Friday, and you have a 24-hour grace period to get the homework in for half credit, and then the solutions for the homework become available early on Sunday morning after all the homework's accepted. Okay, and don't forget I have optional office hours. Those will be Tuesdays and Thursdays from noon to 1 on the Zoom channel that you can click on through your Canvas. And we have also the Ask the Prof discussion board, which I will be watching this week, and you can ask your questions. Okay, take care. I hope you enjoyed our first video. And if I was good at this, I would have gone back to showing my picture rather than doing all this thing. Anyway, I'm carrying on. So you all take care, and I will see you for the next lecture.